How's it going, Eliminators? Today we're going to be working on a 1964 Snowbird S.263. It's an old one, so let's get right into it. So here it is in all its glory. This thing's an old one. It's a Yardman Snowbird, and this is a 1964, I believe. That's what our customer said. And it is a power snow remover, not a snow blower. It's a snow remover. S.263 is the model code on this one, and there is a couple of issues with this thing. After we picked this up, I put this inside of our shed just overnight, and underneath the left tire here there was a little bit of discoloration on the ground, yellow, really nasty stuff. And here's our fuel tank. You can see we just got the little piece that came out of the gas cap taped on there, but if we go down underneath the fuel tank we can see a little bit of wet, nasty stuff. Now that's not oil, that's gas. So I believe we have some sort of leak coming from the fuel tank, or possibly a connection where the line goes. But you guys can see there is a fuel valve underneath there, and it's an old version, so we're gonna have to take a look at that. And if we come over to this side, same thing, there's a little bit of wet spots near the carburetor. So on this model, the carburetor is on the right side near the muffler. We also have some bits of rope stuck into his second stage, so we're gonna have to get that cut out. But this is a two-stage machine. So here's our front stage. You guys can see the impellers come way out from the front of the machine, and this right here, guys, is a design that they ended up getting far away from. So on newer snowblowers you have the shroud that come well past the augers, because well, those are spinning, and if you ever stuck your foot out here, or you know, something got in front of this machine, you could seriously hurt yourselves. So again, now the shrouds come past the augers on the majority of snowblowers that I've seen. Now, I have worked on this snowblower before, so one of our customers called us up and said that he needed a spring replaced on this, and it was back in behind here. It's a spring for the forward and reverse. So what happened was the spring broke and he couldn't get his machine into forward or reverse anymore. It was kind of just in a neutral position. Now, when we looked up the original part number, they were unfortunately discontinued, so you couldn't get that part anymore. So what we ended up doing was we went down to a place that we normally go for springs, and we gave them the length, the number of coils, just from a picture that we got from a manual, and we ended up coming up with this part number right here. So the part number you guys are going to want to look for is 10-3207, and that correlates to an MTD spring number 732-0153. Now the measurements for this spring are 9 inches length with a 4 3/4 inch coil. The coil diameter is 3/4 and the thickness is 7/16. If you need a return spring on this, you can get this spring, so that's your newer part number. Again, the old part number is discontinued now, so you're going to have to go with this newer one right here. And that's just an MTD spring, so in the States you can probably pick that up for like $5. Here in Canada I think it was like $8, and we ended up replacing that, and the guy was happy because, you know, you can't find the original spring for this machine. However, when we worked on it previously, last year, we never ended up doing any work to the carburetor or the fuel tank or anything else like that. So the first big issue is that he says when he's running it, it does run, but when he goes to shut it down and throttle it down, he says it won't shut off. He has to put the choke on, which obviously closes the butterfly valve and floods out the engine. But again, you really don't want to do that, because you'll start to dilute your bottom end oil with fuel, and that's no good, guys. You don't want to do that. So the big issues here today are it won't throttle down, so I'm guessing it's something to do with either the linkage going to the carburetor, which should be this right here. So here's our throttle cable, so you can see open and stop, and then the cable runs down along the frame here up to here. Now I can adjust this by loosening off this screw here and moving this cable back or in, and that in turn will move this bracket, which then goes into your governor somewhere here. So if I move this right here, we can see that it correlates to this right here. Now I'm wondering if maybe he has a kill switch issue, because I can see a wire right here, and if we look, we can see that it's been cut or broke, and I guarantee that that right there is his kill switch wire, and that it's just disconnected itself from the governor system here. So I'm going to start with this right here on the center. There's a little wing nut here. You can lift this centerpiece up just like that, and now we have access to our spark plug and obviously the top of our engine here. And I'm going to be putting all of my parts and pieces into a magnetic parts tray here just so I can keep everything organized. So because I know that it runs, I'm not going to be touching the carburetor, and also I don't want to have to take apart a carburetor that works. So right now the main issues are just fixing the kill wire and then fixing up that leak somewhere from the fuel line or the gas tank. And if we're looking at where this wire came from, well, it came from right here, guys. So right here by our pull start handle, there's a nut on a post, and you can see there's a connector here, and that to me looks exactly like it just broke off and was old. So hopefully I don't have to replace this wire in its entirety. I should have enough room to be able to cut this off and put a new connector on, and then what I can do is unthread that nut, put a new connector on there because we do have enough length, and then reconnect it and see if it works. The only problem is this wire is pretty old, and you guys can see it's starting to get damaged just a little bit just from heat and you know, just from age. So I'm assuming that this wire goes back to the coil or the point system. If it does have one, I'm assuming it does because it is a 1964. And if I have to replace this wire in its entirety, that means that I probably have to take a lot of stuff off. So what I'm going to try to do is, like I said, cut it, put a new end on it and attach it, and then what we can do is I can put a little bit of fuel into this thing once we fix the fuel leak, and then fire this thing up and then go to throttle it down using our throttle up there. And if it shuts the engine off, then we've completed one of our tasks. So before I start pulling anything off, I have a Stens terminal and connector assortment here. You guys can see all bunch of goodies in here, and what I'm going to end up using is one of these right here. Okay, so I pulled the nut off of the ground stud there, and this is what came out of it. Just a little connector here, and we can see that the wire probably just popped out. I could strip the wire, put it back into this one, and then re-crimp it, but I don't want to reuse something old. So I have some new connectors here. Now this one right here is 22 to 18 gauge by 6, and this one fits a little bit tighter on the wire. The only problem is the hole isn't big enough for the stud. So I'm going to go with the one up, which is a 16 to 14 gauge by 10, and the part number there is 418368. So I'm just going to be using one of these. I'm going to crimp it onto the wire, and we're going to hope to see if that fixes our problem. So I got some wire strippers here, and I'm going to be stripping a little bit off of the end of this wire, and then we're going to stick it into our new connector. We're going to crimp it down using the tip of this stripper tool. We're going to put it over this stud. We're going to put the nut back on, and then hopefully that solves the issue of the kill switch. Now, that is essentially a kill switch. So basically what happens is when you move your throttle to the off position or the stop position, basically the spark from the engine is going to ground itself to the frame. So there's a little switch in here that's activated somewhere up behind this shroud. And again, I don't want to have to remove a bunch of stuff if I don't have to, if it's just a simple job of, you know, just stripping this off and reconnecting it. So hopefully this solves the problem. If it doesn't, and there is still some exposed wire, we'll go ahead and tear this thing down, and we'll see if we can replace the wire in its entirety. Okay, so I've stripped some insulation off the end of the wire. I'm going to go ahead, put it in, crimp it down, and we're going to reconnect it. Okay, and once you get that crimped down, it should look a little something like this. And we're going to hook this back up. Now you could put some heat shrink over this, but you really shouldn't have to because this is just a ground wire after all. Okay, so we got our connector all hooked up now. So the ground wire is fixed. Again, you guys can see that goes up underneath all the way into the darkness where it goes inside of the engine to the point system. So again, like I said, you know, hoping that I didn't have to take everything apart to get access at that entire kill wire. As you would call it, or the ground wire to the points. So what I'm going to assume is that it's fixed, and again, you want to make sure that your throttle cable is working as it should, which it is on this model. So I shouldn't have to adjust what I was talking about here earlier, not just yet anyways. Let's get this thing running first. Now, like I stated previously, this machine is currently in running condition. So basically, I'm not going to be tearing his machine down just so I can get it on a video and show you guys the inner workings of this. But I promise you that if our customer ever has a carburetor issue with this machine, I will bring it back here and we'll tear it apart and I'll do a full tear down video. Who knows, maybe next year I'll do a full tune-up on this thing. Oil change, carb clean, you name it, we'll do it. So at this point, I just want to fix the issues that he was experiencing, and I'm not sure he even was aware that it was leaking fuel, so he must have left the fuel valve open or something happened, but we're going to address that next. So what I'm going to do is remove this shroud on this side, and we're going to take off those screws. And again, same design as the other side. There's going to be one bolt here and two screws up here, and we're going to just remove this shroud from the fuel tank. But just so you guys get an idea of how old this thing is, I know I said it was a 1964, but if we look here at where the spark plug boot normally goes, you guys can see that this isn't even a spark plug boot. It's like kind of like a fork that they just stick over top of the spark plug and just hope that it doesn't fall off, which is pretty crazy. Again, if you ever had an issue with this, I would replace that with like an NGK spark plug cap, you know, a rubber one, a newer one, something that threads in onto this high tension lead right here, and then, you know, we could actually snap it down on top of a newer spark plug. But again, he says that it does run, so because it runs, I don't want to have to mess around with anything that works. So we're going to leave that for now. And a little cool thing, this is the hand crank down here, and this operates the second stage snow chute here. So you guys can see that the chute comes out of the second stage. Now normally what happens is those are in a fixed position and only your chute pivots left and right, whereas on this model, this whole center section, the whole second stage area, rotates up and down. So I'll show you guys. So if we crank the hand lever back here, you guys can see that it's chain driven from a rod here that goes all the way across the top of the engine. And this whole chute moves left and right. Pretty crazy, huh? Check that out. So that's like super old school design right there. And as that thing turns left and right, your chute kind of positions itself either forward or more towards the right side of the machine there. Pretty cool stuff. I mean, this thing, like I said, is a 1964, and as far as I know, from the information that I could find online, guys, the first model of this was a 1958 Snowbird FB. This is a 1964 S.263. So only 5 years later, but there's a ton of different designs. So it's the newer design. On the older ones, I believe they had the muffler coming out of the back here, and they didn't have this symmetrical shroud design as far as I know from the pictures that I could see. But these things are super interesting, and our customer that asked us to service this, he's actually in a group on a forum website that they all get together and kind of share their knowledge of what they know, because again, parts are super hard to find for these things. So if one person is looking for a part and another person finds something that they can use, again, like we did with that spring at the back, which I can show you, basically we took the newer part number and gave it to him, and he posted it up on his forum site so that he let everybody know if they ever need one of those springs that are discontinued, they can use this newer part number to find exactly what they're looking for. So I'll show you that spring that we replaced. The only thing is, when we put this back together, there was 2 wing nuts there, and now there's only 1. So he's been using it, and I'm assuming that one of them rattled out. I really don't like this design. You guys can see they're kind of super loose, and they must have just vibrate themselves out. They're not like an actual bolt, and they don't thread in that nicely because they have a really coarse thread. So that thing must have just backed itself out, and he might have lost it on the driveway. But once you get those wing nuts off, you should be able to just lift this back access panel off, move that out of the way, and now you have access to your back belts and all your pulleys. So obviously you have a fixed pulley here, you have a fixed pulley here, this one comes out of the engine, and you have some idler pulleys right there. So again, the spring that we had to replace was right here. So he would have been just using this snowblower as normal, and the spring just over the years got worn out to the point where it got into a weakened state and it just snapped itself. And the problem was that it snapped itself like up here, and we were missing like the top half or I believe the bottom half. This was last year, so I can't really remember that well. But what we did was we ended up matching a newer spring. We ended up testing it, and it worked perfectly fine. And our customer was thrilled that we could find that and replace it for him, because he knew when he looked and searched up the original part number for the original spring, he knew that that part was discontinued. So again, he was happy that we were able to fix that up for him. Now, looking at these belts, sooner or later, he's going to need belt replacements. As we can see, some tearing starting to happen and some fraying. You guys can see there, the belts are starting to wear out a little bit, and they will over time. Eventually they will need to be replaced, but he never said that there was any issues with this snowblower not throwing snow, so we're not going to do any belts. I just wanted to remove this panel just to show you guys, and I will try to find a bolt to replace his missing little wing nut there. Okay, so I was able to find a bolt with the same threads. However, you guys can clearly see that this is way too long, and it might end up doing some damage to his pulley if I just go and thread that in there all the way. So what I'm going to do is take this out and cut it off using a zip disc. I'll clean up the ends of the bolt, but at least he'll have something to hold that in there, because I wasn't able to find his wing nut inside of there, so it must have just dropped out. So I'll probably end up cutting this thing the same length as the other one, but at least he'll have something in there to hold that shroud in. And having a bunch of these laying around, just random nuts and bolts that you never use, you should try to organize them as best you can, but again, if you just throw them in a pile, you can always just find something like this. I reached in, I thought, you know, that looks similar, and sure enough, it fit right away. It was the first one I picked. So again, having something like this, guys, after all these years, you accumulate all of these, you know, junk bolts that you know, never use or end up getting thrown out. And if you ever need something, well, you got it. And you guys can see we got quite a few of these things laying around. Okay, so I got my bolt inside of the vise here. I've just made a mark here with a permanent marker and matched it up with our old bolt just to get a, you know, estimate of a length. And I'm going to cut that off using my angle grinder here with a zip disc, and then what I'll do is I'll clean up the ends and file the thread if I have to, just to make it a little cleaner. That's it. Now, an old trick that you can do is, if you have a nut, go ahead and put your nut on, and then once you cut it, you can back your nut off past it, and most of the times what it'll do is it'll just clean up the thread on its own. But because I don't have a nut, basically I just have to cut this. So if your threads are damaged, like they might be here, what I'm going to do is take a really fine file and just make sure that those threads are good, and then we'll go ahead and thread this inside to make sure it fits good. And then we'll fit up the panel, put it back in, and that's done. You guys can see that fits perfectly. It threads all the way in, and we're far away from our pulley. So that part's done. So once I wipe this up, I'll put the panel back on, get our bolts back into it, and then we can move on to the gas tank. There, that looks a little better. So again, like I said, we're going to leave the belts for now. So what I'm going to do is recommend that next year Eliminator Performance change both his drive belt and his auger belt, just so that he's got new belts and he won't have to worry the year after. These should still be good for another year, but once you start getting into frayed belts like you see here, guys, it ends up being more of like a fabric than an actual belt with, you know, like a rubbery grab to it. So you end up getting into slipping issues because it ends up getting real soft, like really soft. It's almost like a t-shirt fabric more than an actual belt that would feel like it would have a rubber texture to it. So again, we're not going to change the belts now, but I will recommend that next year Eliminator Performance changes his belts. And I'm also going to be using some blue Permatex thread locker. We're going to be putting a big dollop on there. Again, you know, this thing probably does have vibration issues because these old engines are known to vibrate quite a bit, because they don't have any real balancers in the crankshaft or anything like the newer engines do. So again, a little bit of blue thread locker will go a long way. I don't want to use red because that just makes them harder to get off. So a little bit of blue thread locker should help keep those bolts from backing off. Now, once you get your 2 screws out of the top of here and your 3/8 bolt out of the front there may be another bolt at the back here, but when I had this panel off, I checked, and on this model, there wasn't anything back there. So now we should be able to just grab a hold of this shroud, and if we can pop it out of here, we should be able to just pull this off. And now our fuel tank and our fuel valve at the bottom are exposed and we can have access to them a little better. So it appears that this tank, obviously it's an old machine, so it has an old style fuel valve. That's known as a petcock. Basically it's an on and an off. So on this one you unthread it, and when it comes down to the bottom it allows fuel to go from the tank into your fuel line, which is in good condition, so I'm not going to change. The only thing is our customer must have forgot that it was on, and while it was sitting here the fuel kind of just leaked out all over the place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to thread this in and tighten it up all the way, and I'm going to put some fuel in it and see if it leaks. And if it doesn't leak when it's off like that, then I'm going to start to open it up and then see if it starts dripping. And I'm going to put a little jar up underneath this thing just to catch any drips that do come out. But the thing is, I don't have one of these petcocks in stock. I have the newer kind, the plastic black and red ones. You guys have seen them before, and unfortunately they won't work on this, so I would have to get a newer petcock, unthread it here. The problem is when you go to unthread these, sometimes you can strip the threads in the fuel tank, and then it's just a nightmare. So the first thing I'm going to do is put some fuel in it and see if it leaks. If it does leak, then I'll call my customer and say, listen, you know, you do have a leaking fuel valve, but at least if I get some fuel in it, I'll check the oil, make sure the oil's good, which it should be. Then I can fire it up and go to kill it. And if the engine shuts off when I throttle it down, then I know that the fix that I did for the kill switch works and that's all good. And then basically the only thing will be that fuel valve, and either finding a new one that I can thread in there or just leaving it if my customer doesn't mind. But again, a fuel leak is no good. You know, that could always lead to a fire or something like that, which you never want to have. So let me go ahead and get some fuel in here, see if it leaks, and then I'll bring you back. Okay, so next up we're gonna loosen off the dipstick here. We're gonna pull this out and we're gonna check his oil. Now I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but there is F, stamped F for full, and you guys can see right at the center there, the oil stops. So we're a little bit low because this thing probably does burn a little bit of oil because it is old. So I'm just gonna top it up. We did an oil change last year, and the oil still looks fairly clean, so I'm not gonna change it. We're just gonna add a little bit of oil. And for this engine, I'm gonna be using a premium Castrol GTX 5W30 motor oil. You guys can see now we're right at the full mark, so that's good. So now the oil's topped up. Okay, so I've wiped off the side of the machine here because I wanna make sure that everything was clean and that I could distinguish what was wet from fuel and what was wet from fuel before. So I just wiped everything down, so now it's dry. I have the fuel valve currently in the closed position, and I just got my hand under here. I'm reaching in, I'm feeling, making sure that it's not leaking from where the threads go into the petcock, and that it's leaking from here. So I don't think it's leaking when it's in the closed position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a jar, put it under here, and then I'm going to start to slowly open this up and see at which point it starts to leak, and then I'll back it off from there and see if it will run at the position where it doesn't leak, just to see so that I can tell my customer. So I'm at 2 turns out now and it's still not leaking, which is a good sign. So I'm gonna go 2.5 turns, still not leaking. That's 3 turns, it's still not leaking. Now I got a feeling if I go all the way, it will start to leak, but that is 3 turns out, and it's still dry. It's still pretty dry at 3 turns. So there's 3.5. That's maxed all the way out. So I'm assuming that at about, 4 turns, 4.5 turns, whatever that was, I'm assuming that if I leave this overnight, it'll start dripping slowly, but I can't see anything coming out now. And I do have 1/2 liter of fuel in there, so I'm not sure where that fuel was dripping from. So I'm just gonna try and test this thing out as it is right now. We solved the issue of the kill switch, hopefully. So what I'm gonna do now is bring this outside. Okay, so we got this thing outside. Fuel valve's on. I'm gonna fire it up, see what happens. Throttle to on. Oh, and by the way, if you're gonna try and start this thing, here's the choke lever right here. So you guys are gonna wanna choke it. Yeah, that'll help. This thing fired up first pull. Obviously, once I put the choke on. Runs awesome though. And our kill wire fix solved the problem. So now when he goes to throttle it down into the stop position, it shuts the engine off. And that's what he said the original issue was, guys. When he called us, he said he would throttle that down and it wouldn't shut itself off. And that was because his kill wire down here just broke off and it pulled out from the connector there. So the only thing about this is gee, when I was going to take this thing off a choke, the muffler's right here, and it's just blowing fumes into your face when you go to choke this thing off. So maybe a little tip would be to stand over here, and after you fire it up, reach in from the front and then shut it off, because my head was basically right there. And, you know, this is the first time that I started this thing in a year, and I forgot that the choke was over there. But yeah, this thing runs awesome. So this thing is done, guys. It's ready to return back to our customer. And by the way, if any of you guys are ever on Facebook, check out Eliminator Performance on Facebook. It's www.facebook.com/Eliminator Performance. I update Facebook more than anything else. You know, we do have a Twitter account at Eliminator Perf. It's Eliminator PERF. You can check us out on Twitter too, but on the Facebook page, I update every other day. Sometimes if we're really busy, then I don't for a couple days. But if you ever want to see what goes on behind the scenes, or you know what we're working on well before we end up airing a video here on YouTube, you guys can follow us on Facebook. And I think right now we got like 50 followers or something like that. So it's just friends that I know from school and whatnot. But yeah, if you guys want to check us out, follow us on Facebook. I'd really appreciate that. And it really is hard to believe, but this thing fired up first pull. Obviously, once I remembered to turn the choke on, you know, I pulled it, and I said, something's not right here. And then it kind of clicked, you know, in my head, and I thought, well, I forgot to turn the choke on. But as soon as I choked it, that thing fired up literally the first pull. And there's a little bit of hunting at the beginning, but that's only when it's not warmed up. So hunting is basically like a high-low rev, where your air-to-fuel mixture is still stabilizing itself. So when you get a little more fuel and the mixture is richened, the revs lower slightly, and then when you get a little bit less fuel, the mixture becomes a little leaner, so more air, less fuel, and it revs up a little bit. But once that stabilizes, which really only took, I'm gonna say maybe 10 seconds, not even, that thing, it runs awesome, guys. And I can't believe how good this thing runs for how old it is. But there you go. But again, that's why I want to reiterate what I was saying before of, like, you know, I'd love to do a carb teardown and a complete service of this thing, but it really doesn't need it. It's got oil in it, and it's got the right amount. The carb works, so I'm not going to start tearing stuff apart if it doesn't need to be. But again, like I told you guys, if our customer has any issues with the carburetor on this snowblower, what we'll do is we'll bring it back into our shop, and I'll do a complete teardown of the carburetor, so that if anybody out there online is you know, wondering how to clean a carb on one of these things, or how to do a full oil change, I'll be able to show you. Well, that's it for today's video, guys. If you enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You can click here to subscribe, and you can click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every week, so be sure to come on back next week. Check out what we got new on the channel. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.